Hi, and welcome to Radio Free XP. It's Friday, April 12th, and Jesse and I are talking books.
I'm looking forward to it.
The first book we're going to talk about is Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. Jesse, you want to do a quick gloss, or are we going to move right on?
Yeah, Never Split the Difference is a book about negotiation. Chris Voss is a FBI hostage negotiator, and then I think about 10 years in that and about 10 years in corporate and leadership consultancy before writing the book. And it covers not just a sort of it does cover a tactical approach to negotiation, but it also covers some of the psychological resistance that people have to negotiation and gets into what's really going on in a negotiation in a way that makes negotiating and the skills around it relevant and accessible to a general audience reader.
I'll say it a slightly different way. Keep your soul and learn to negotiate.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to do that one more time. I'll say it one more way, which is learn to negotiate and keep your soul.
It is a very human approach in a way that you might not detect with its hostage negotiator, macho law enforcement sort of branding. Once you get into the details of it, which we will later, we're going to discuss these two books together. It doesn't, it has a lot of empathy and humanity.
Book 2?
Turn the Ship Around.
David Marquet has been a guest on the podcast, and this book just pays off so beautifully to me. It is an alternative to what you see in the major Fortune 500. And if we actually got a book and wrote down what we were doing at Pivotal, it would probably look a lot like this.
Yeah, and this book was influential at Pivotal. The subtitle is A True Story of Turning Followers into Leaders. It's a book by the captain of the nuclear submarine Santa Fe. It talks about the process of taking over the ship on short notice when he wasn't technically familiar with it, and taking it from abysmal performance to peak performance compared to its peers. A lot of details. Again, the military framing might sort of suggest a tone and a character that this book does not have, or it has some of it, but this is a book that is very deeply about organizations and leadership, and not like, it is not a typical military book. It talks about the normal Navy as this like problem that needs to be overcome in some cases. So it's fascinating, and we've chosen these two books to talk about. One, these books kind of want to pair. I think the discussion of these two books links very nicely at various stages. Two, we've talked about developing sort of a radio free XP canon of books. I don't know if it's a syllabus or a library or reading list, whatever you want to talk about. We think there are maybe 5 or 6 books on there, but we can't really just do the episode where we go through all of them and say what they are until we've done some episodes introducing them more piece by piece. And we are starting with these chunks because on some level, a lot of the other stuff is about technical excellence and about how to conduct various certain types of business or business processes. But I think that technical excellence doesn't matter as much as people think it does in most circumstances. It's not a dominant factor. You have to earn the ability to benefit from technical excellence. Then developing it further or having it matters a lot more. But once you've earned the ability to benefit from technical excellence, it begins to matter. But you can look all around you and see places where they got the distribution or the sales or the funding or some dominant business factor, some business model, something went right, and all their technical ability had to do was meet a threshold of not failing. So the stuff that is necessary to put yourself in a position to benefit from technical insolence, well, technical insolence too, but technical excellence, putting yourself in a position to benefit from technical excellence is something that you can sometimes do by negotiating, and that you can sometimes do by looking around and realizing how to change parts of your organization in a way that will let you benefit from it. And it's about looking around and realizing that the negotiation that you need to do is about leaving, about joining somewhere else or starting something new. But the negotiation is still going to need to be there. So these two books form really strong parts of my theory of how you earn the ability individually to benefit from technical excellence, and how you can be part of an organization where your technical excellence matters to the organization.
100%. I mean, these books are how you get past your one team that gets technical excellence.
Yeah.
Well, should we just start on how they want to talk?
Yeah. So I wrote a bunch of notes when reading both of these, and I'm trying to figure out where I want to come back in on them here.
Can I give you a lead?
Yes, please do.
The thing about turn the ship around is it comes right down and says, like, look, if you can't give, in this case, the sailors something to actually believe is meaningful, then you're sunk.
Hmm.
And the thing they choose in the book to say what they're doing is we are learning continuously how to operate a nuclear submarine.
Yeah. Right.
And once you set the anchor there, then you fall back to the tools in Never Split the Difference for how to negotiate that. Like, hey, you're doing XYZ and it's a bottom level baseline job. And what we need you to do is be very interested in learning how to do this job.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a stage negotiation.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, so I love Turn the Ship Around, and I was talking with other people who love Turn the Ship Around. And one of them pointed out one of the issues with Turn the Ship Around is that reading the book does not necessarily leave you in a position and with the skills to do what is depicted in the book. It shows some of the skills and some of the thing, like some of the characteristics of a good solution for how to do this, but it doesn't necessarily actually give you the ability or even a real lead on that ability to do some of these things. And I think this is where pairing with Never Split the Difference helps some. It's not the only book that you would need to fill in the abilities here. And the book itself, I think one of the great things about Turn the Ship Around is it does recommend other books that were the sources of the skill that he built on to do what he did. The habits of effective or highly effective people, and the eighth habit in the text, Out of the Crisis by Deming, recommended in the text. The visual display of quantitative information is in the text as one of the book. He uses it several times towards the end of chapters. Like, the book to read on this is, and he presents his sort of canon of the things that brought him to this point. I didn't remember from my previous read that Deming's Out of the Crisis was in here. He actually talks about it for a moment where he's like, so the Navy views total quality management or total quality leadership, the Deming idea, as a failed or a past fad, but it's because they tried to implement it using a non-total quality leadership way and failed. I think the ideas are valuable, and I recommend his work to you. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's pretty close to a quote. And I missed that the first time through, that Out of the Crisis was a substantial influence. It makes sense that this would be a substantial influence.
Yeah, that's what I really like about Turn the Ship Around. It is a worked example.
Yeah.
Right. And there are these things that you are going to have to fill in, but David Marquet is that chief negotiator. He is the one who is coming up with the, creative solution and finding the angle that is going to be meaningful for the person in front of him.
Yeah.
And you can see that in the book, but yeah, you got to develop that skill set.
You got to develop that skill set, and he talks about it. But then if you want the theory and a bunch more examples of just a specific thing, Voss talks about tactical empathy in Never Split the Difference. So this tactical empathy concept of like using neural resonance to understand someone better, and this description of empathy as the ability to understand what someone is experiencing and wanting. And this tactical empathy emphasizes in this negotiation context that this is to advance your own goals. This isn't like a spiritual exercise or something about virtue in an abstract sense. This is a tool. And he mentions when he's introducing this that blustery hardline type negotiators, if you describe this technique or even perform it, might consider you to be weak, that it straight up can call this reaction down of people saying like, well, that's surrender, or that's giving in, or whatever. Empathy is none of those things. Empathy is how you win. And I think that's something that both Turn the Ship Around and Never Split the Difference understand together, is that empathy is how you win. It's something that both books tools for practicing. And I think that if I was going to pull a single unified theme out of these two books, They understand the utility and challenge of empathy, and they provide frameworks for reminding you to do the hard cognitive work of entering empathy. So, Turn the Ship Around has this thing, this amazing thing, where Marquet, the captain of a nuclear submarine, shortly into taking over, decides he will never issue an order. Now, this is actually to the other insane thing that he does, because I have to go find my note here. Page 24 of this book, he dedicates himself to full-time pairing for production work. The quote is, "I decided that everything I did on Santa Fe would be with an officer, a chief, or a crew member." Okay, so here we have a captain who shows up on a submarine and says, "I'm going to pair exclusively on production work."
Yeah, and let's at least acknowledge that this is a forced virtue, right? Which is he does not know this submarine. He does not know. He's supposed to. A captain shows up for these submarines and knows it literally bolt for bolt. They can beat anyone on the boat. That's the whole point of a captain, and he cannot do this here.
Right.
And he talks a lot about like how hard that is.
Well, because he was planning to be the captain of a different submarine, and then the transfer to the Santa Fe was a late breaking development. And I think this is really interesting that academic study is the thing that he is like resorting to pairing of, which seems crazy to me because it's much more effective. And he'll talk about this too, where he's like, it was very helpful to be forced to do the things I wanted to do, because he failed previous to coming on to the Santa Fe. He has a whole couple of experiences on other ships where the normal leader follower model, as opposed to the leader model that they develop on the Santa Fe, is something that he falls back to in order to recover from failing, from a partial or not fully realized or unsuccessful implementation of what he wants to do. And he had that available to fall back to in these other cases. He had his own technical competence and his own study and his own ability to bluster around and declare things to fall back on. But being put onto a machine that he was not technically prepared for, he couldn't be running this technocracy where he's top technocrat, which is good for him. At least in retrospect, he rationalizes he didn't want to. But I think the fact that he tried to do it and failed and then was forced to try again is really good fortune for him and for all of us.
And as he revealed when he was on our show, he went through some very rough times, and he has stood for this model and has succeeded a few times and has failed a few times, and he talks about that.
Yeah.
It's a word, a word of warning for all of this. Like that. That's why Voss. You have to come back to Voss, because this tactical empathy thing is not, as Jesse says, it's not a weakness. A really good example from the Voss canon, which I heard on a show, not in the book, is he tells this very brief story of some man whose wife says, "I want to get a real Christmas tree," and he's like, "No, I want a fake Christmas tree," and he just like kind of harumphs that off. And then he remembers his Voss training. He's like, "Well, what would it be like for you if we got a real tree?" And she's like, "Well, I had a real tree as a kid. I loved it, and I want our kids to have that experience." And the story is the man's like, "You know what? I just completely did not even take that point of view. Now that I take it, I can't even imagine why I would oppose that. Please go get a real tree."
Yeah.
And in the tactical empathy, like it's not, as you say, it's not meant to be a knife, but it's also meant to be to get you to what you actually want.
I want to do a little sidebar on knives. We had our previous episode where you were talking about being in a room with people with knives, and Elizabeth was like, "I don't know if they had knives, Tony," and you just talked about the knife again here. I have a really different concept when I say the knife, because I also refer to a knife metaphorically a lot. You're talking about potential stabbing. It's the backstabbing knife, or maybe the front stabbing knife, right? When you
Or
bring
even the
these.
flint.
Well, okay, so here's the thing. When I talk about a knife, there's this notion in a video game of something that separates the real from the dead. This is I think of a knife that cuts things apart, that separates a real thing and a thing that was not actually real, that needs to be cut away. And it's an esoteric meaning. I think yours is more widely understood. But every time you do it, I have this little flash of like, oh, but this is a knife. Tactical empathy is a knife because it lets you separate the real, it's at least the that is shared between you and a person that you're talking to, and things that will not help you, that are irrelevant. From the Voss canon, is winning doing what your first impulse is about this Christmas tree? No, absolutely not. That is not a victory. So negotiation is not all about your initial position. The other thing I really
Yeah.
like about Never Split the Difference, it's right there in the title. I dislike compromises. Never Split the Difference is about arriving at solutions in reality. And sometimes, if you're a hostage negotiator, people who are holed up in a building and surrounded by people with guns, they don't want to go to jail and they don't want to get shot, but they'd rather go to jail than get shot. And reality doesn't have a lot of other options for them. And that's not the fault of the negotiator, right? The negotiator is part of the forces that are making that true. The negotiator is not in a place where they can be like, you know what? We're going to let you go. Everyone knows that. That's real. But that you can still empathize and operate together in the reality where we know you don't want to get shot or go back to jail is something that you can say without having to say, and I'm going to let that happen for you. It's just acknowledging what's true. And
Yeah.
getting into that empathetic state and realizing what's true doesn't just mean winning in these types of negotiations where you have the other person surrounded by a superior military force, right? Like that refines a type of negotiation and sort of, to use your term, flenses it down to like it cuts away a lot of wiggle room in the scenarios. And I think that's helpful for demonstrating the techniques. But it's really useful to scope back to these other circumstances. um, Marquet tells a story about someone who goes AWOL on his ship, who, and that's very bad news, but he needs this officer. He is surprised that this person has gone AWOL. And generally, there's an expected response here where that person's got to go to captain's mast. They're going to face discipline and impact to their career, at least. And he declines to do this ultimately by, again, tactical empathy. About this person had, in the last 36 hours, due to various policies, had his amount of time to sleep reduced to 0. And so, yeah, he, threw down his tools and stormed off, but he went into base housing and checked in and got a bed and just went to sleep. Like he was, needed it. And being able to get that officer back, in that case, he was talking to somebody who could say, well, you're not going to get punished for this, who was able to take away the I bet you don't want to get discharged from the Navy. So anyway, I was on my way to a point earlier, and I'm still trying. I want to try and get back to it. After deciding that he's going to pair full time for production work, he then shortly in decides that he will never give an order. The captain of a nuclear submarine decides he will never give an order. And, I read that section a few times. I was just like, I cannot believe this. This is on page 81. The captain of a nuclear submarine makes a vow to not give any orders ever. So they end up with this I intend to construction, where someone can walk up to the captain and say, Captain, I intend to submerge the submarine. And I took that away on my first read. I'm like, that's a great way to do things. But they actually develop it further pretty quickly. And this is going to link all the way back around to the point about how both Turn the Ship Around and Never Split the Difference have systems for practicing tactical empathy. The Captain I Intend to story, in addition to saying what they intend to do, they start talking about why they intend to do this, and found himself asking a lot of questions of people who came up and announced their intentions. And they would answer them, and then he'd be able to say, very well. And one day he asked his XO, who had just announced an intention, instead of just asking the questions he had in mind or saying very well, he said, and what do you think I'm thinking about your intention? Well, I suppose you're wondering if it's safe and appropriate to submerge. Why don't you tell me why you think it's safe and appropriate when you announce your intention? And then all I'll have to say is very well. And I think this is an amazing, because now, and he points this out explicitly as he comes back around to other cases of people doing this. Everyone on the ship, when they announce their intention to someone, has to empathize with that person and think about, what are they going to think about my intention? And then they can address that. There's another book that at some point I want to put elsewhere. It may actually belong as a triple with these, but we'll talk about it, which is Barbara Minto's The Minto Pyramid Principle. This is a book about writing McKinsey consulting reports, persuasive reports. Barbara Minto was like the first female McKinsey consultant, and this is an old book, and it comes with all those caveats. But it's the pyramid in the title is this structure. People can think about 3 to 5 to 7 things. So you need each line of your argument to reference into 5 to 7 things that decompose into the layers below them. And you structure your whole argument that way. And the way you decide what goes on each line of that is you start with what you want someone to agree to, and then you answer the questions that will raise in their mind. This is the same thing, and it's another way to
Yeah.
practice this tactical empathy.
Yeah. Let me name this whole thing here. Marquet there is making this crazy investment in judgment. What he's saying to everyone around him is your judgment actually matters. And much like we did at Pivotal, someone will check. And that whole loop of what is your judgment? How do you articulate it? And does it carry the day? You don't have to do that to the captain more than 3 times before you figure out exactly what's going on.
Right. The feedback loop is tightened, and the people are having constant practice at empathizing with someone and then trying to give them the information they need. And then when the person asks questions, you have to separate a little bit if they're asking questions because structurally they are committed to asking questions at that point in the interaction. I don't think any of the books actually talk about this. I've just had this experience where it's like, oh, this is the question slot. Like, I don't need to worry about this question. Anyway, you anticipate what what questions are going to be raised in the mind of the person you're talking to based on what you say. And then you can, if you've made the agreement already, if you've got the pattern, you can set a pattern up where, if you've got the pattern or you've set a pattern up where, those are the same thing. Anyway, where you don't actually have to say anything else than very well. And you can get that as a target where it's like, great, that wins. And also notice very well, even Picard on Star Trek says make it so, but that's an order. Right? Marquet is observing his vow here to express acceptance, but not give an order. They mean the same thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The thing about the book for a leader who's reading it is you really get to go along with Marquet's evolution here. And he is not positive how it's going to turn out, and he runs into real problems. Like, I think we should probably pause for a second to say these books are great, and they do give a real life example with real results, including like a very high percentage of people approved for captaincy that worked under him. These are how you measure these things, either in academics or the military. What leaders did they produce, or what scholars did they produce after them?
And the performance evaluations of the system, and he brings a repeated emphasis back to the system after he has left. This is not a subject of great overlap between the two. This is something where I think Turn the Ship Around is the bigger book, the better book, the more holistic book, because it talks more about goals, whereas Never Split the Difference talks more about tactics. That's great. They need each other. And there are things in the system you're shooting for. There's a story about a new way to refuel where the system, once he got it running the way he wanted it to run, where it was a leader model and people were figuring out what to do and doing it without even needing approval beyond, like, with only going up to the level of authority that was necessary for coherence and not extending it beyond that. They were able to invent and apply a at-sea resupply measure in a way that protected their critical stat, which is their ability to respond to orders. They had a 100% ability to take their missions, and they needed more oil because of an unanticipated leak, from a junior crewman seeing a supply ship and saying, why don't we ask them, to the team figuring out how to surface and how to take it on board and arranging the ability for people to go over and get their dental work done during the transfer. And just like there would be no time, there would be no ability to plan this in a top-down way. But because of this parallel spontaneous generation that's possible within the framework of leader, new capabilities are available for the system. I loved that example. And it seems it's this brief moment of, and then it worked. In the book, it's sort of like the first part, here's how I thought it was going to go, then a long section of struggle, and then the latter part of the book is, and then it worked. But it's actually a lot more than just then it worked. If you take that particular example, it's so easy for me to imagine the many circumstances, the many missed opportunities that I have seen, even at Pivotal, because Pivotal did not have a fully realized leader culture. This book led to insights and changes. It was aligned with what Pivotal did. Many parts of Pivotal successfully worked this way, but this is where the person I was talking to who had the insight that turned the ship around does not make you good at doing what is described in the book. People who read the book at Pivotal did not succeed at creating the leader structure within the places that they were trying to apply it at first. And it takes time, and then the whole VMware acquisition and pandemic happened and the game changed deeply. This is not to be critical of those people at all or of the model, but to say it's absolutely true that you get goals from one side. Voss talks not at all about the long-term framework of like what goals do you pursue or any of that. Like, you need these things together. You keep your soul with Voss, but it's just kind of bringing along a cultural default in terms of what the values are, right? Good guys win, bad
Yeah.
guys lose, no one dies, no one gets hurt. It's like, okay, fine,
Yeah.
this is like action movie values.
Ethics, right? Yeah. Yeah. I do want to on turn the ship around. One of the other great things that he says is lean into the auditors.
Yes.
And in terms of in terms of instilling judgment in the sailors, and then really becoming a learning organization, they just asked, "Hey, how do you want to see this?" And but like their numbers went up because he literally trained crewmen to ask an auditor. We think blah blah blah. We did it like this. How do you want to see it?
Right. And he trained
And
them experientially, in part with this intention expressing thing. He did not order
yeah,
them to do that. He did,
no,
before he decided to give up orders, he did order them to greet everyone on the ship using the 3-name rule: the name of the ship, the
yep,
name of the person, and the name of the crewman doing the greeting. But initial uptake on the thing he gave as an order was only like 10%. The crewman working closely with the auditors and all that subsequently comes from the actual ignition of a learning culture, that experience of benefiting from asking questions and being curious.
yeah, yeah. And it he talks a lot about the challenges of how do you even find the motivation for folks.
Right.
And this is where Voss really comes in, because in this tactical empathy sense, he just went and found out what irritates especially enlisted folks and worked to eliminate that.
Mhm.
He found out what chiefs want, what makes their promotions and pay increases. That's what makes their life. And so he's like, well, let's be good at doing that. And he the book really gives you this sense of walking through. And you know you have had deep experience of trying to, I don't know, we would call it generally shouldering aside the impediments placed in the way of
Yeah.
your way at the organization. And I have certainly been at many places where you just don't even know where to start, and it is hard. I don't, I don't know how to express that as clearly. But when you land at a place and there is no agreement, you have to use a model like Voss to find anything anyone wants, and then to help build the alignment with that.
Yeah.
And I'll touch on the one Voss rule that really, like, if you can get this idea, then most of what Voss says flows, and it's that no deal is better than a bad deal. And so a lot of people will get really stuck on making a deal just to close it. That's the never split the difference or the compromise. But Voss is like, no. Jesse, this is probably a good time to drop the why are compromises generally not an optimal thing.
Yeah. I don't like compromises conceptually as a goal because I think that they are basically mediocre. Compromises accept of sort of conventional failure, their outcome of like, oh, well, nobody's satisfied. So it must be, you hear this all the time about political situations. Nobody's satisfied, so it must be a good bill. Everyone hates something about it. It's insane. And our political system that delivers this outcome is something I don't want to get too deeply into, but I don't think it's working very well. And I don't think that compromise that compromise as a good thing can really generalize from this strange adversarial deliberative amendment body governing structure. Like, that's its own whole specific thing. We're not in it. The vast majority of the time, people have an ability to collaborate, and they are not going to have as conflicted an outcome, it seems like, And if either of them accepts a compromise, both of them are losing that they would not have needed to. And sometimes it's worse than that. Worse is in more unfair, in that a compromise is only harming one of them. So compromises tend to enhance and reinscribe power differences.
Yeah, agreed.
Actual work
Let me
solutions, like negotiated settlements, negotiated solutions, you can characterize some of them as compromises. I am not trying to, and Never Split the Difference is not trying to, by it's the quite the opposite of trying to get people to like not talk or take an absolutist or belligerent stance. But compromise, it's right there in the etymology of the word. When you talk about compromise, think about how else you use that word. The structural integrity of the hull has been compromised. You're giving up integrity every time you take on a compromise.
I hadn't made that connection, but I'm big on integrity, and that is a great point. There, let me drop the engineering axiom here, which is a compromise between two sensical solutions is almost never a sensical solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And the reason that it's not a sensical solution is that it compromises the integrity of both of them. And so any gain that you might get by the sensibility of one solution, or the way that things have to work, or an idiom that you're establishing, or a model, you lose all the benefits of that as soon as it is compromised with something incoherent to that. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we jumped off on the auditors, and this was just so clear to me because even, in my entire professional life, I always move toward auditors for for exactly the reasons that Marquet says. Uh, they will tell you, and frequently they're not crazy.
Right.
They're like, "Hey, we're trying to do this, and like, there's no actual viable path for this." And they're like, "Oh, you're one of our billions of clients who have noticed that there's no viable path to billions of things here. So here's how we take care of that."
Yeah. Right.
And sometimes it's really that easy, and sometimes it's like, well, you guys are already producing this thing, so you must have the information to produce this other thing, and that's what the audit requirement is.
Right. And
Like, oh, that's
there are
helpful.
problems with auditors in every situation, right? Enron is actually an auditor scandal. The auditors did Enron, right? So, like, there's this complicated, auditors are a complicated concept. When you take something like the Navy that is operating a mission that, yeah, has nominal missions of various sorts, but the real mission is be available for a military mission should it arise with maximal capacity, like continuously regenerate capacity that is hard to maintain. And so exercises and audits and scoring are how they do that. This is how NATO operates as well. This is why there are all these joint maneuvers out there. Auditing is not just going over documentation or seeing that you say what you've written down. It's also often scoring on a way to maintain readiness in the absence of a crisis. So there are auditors who are regulatory auditors. There are auditors who are internal or investigative auditors. There are auditors who are uh, only auditors because of the need to change the reporting chain so that there's not a conflict of interest. And Navy auditors are very much this last category, as described in the book by and large, of these are people who to not be accountable to the deployment needs of the fleet or of the careers of the captains or any of these other things. They're concerned about things like the safe operation of nuclear reactors. And it's all right. That gets to trump. Like when they mess up your deployment plan as a captain or someone else who has failed to live up to their standards, their priority wins. And that's appropriate. And it's when you get down to it, that's correct. So especially that type of auditor, you absolutely want to move towards. And this is something that I think a lot of people have a dysfunctional relationship to bureaucracy around. Bureaucracy can be so grating and so self-sustaining and pointless and grim, and just like it's so easy to turn it into this sort of zombie horde and just have nothing but disgust for it. This is self-defeating. I've collapsed into it when I've been burnt out. So it's part of a downward spiral when you collapse into this self-defeating view of bureaucracy. Again, radical empathy will show you what these people's actual goals and needs are, and you can be aligned. You can be on the same side.
And this is
Oh,
this is where we throw in one of Voss's major things is start with no. It's okay to start with no. That is the to me what Voss gives me is somewhere to go from nothing.
Mm.
Like, hey, can we talk about this? No. Like, okay, well then I just don't understand anything that's important to this person,
Right.
and so I have to keep moving, right? And as you said, sometimes you find out like, oh, this person is unsatisfiable, which is an extraordinarily important thing to learn.
Right.
If we jump back to Voss, he talks about some people who were simply unsatisfiable.
Yeah.
They're like, that's not how the Navy works, and I won't do it. And from a Voss perspective, you're kind of stuck.
Right.
And if you can't find something that will interest that person or move them along that you can offer them, then uh, then you get to the dealing with the with the people who are just a no.
Right. The thing about, and we talked with Brian Kroger, and he talked about this bureaucracy hacking notion, among other things. Bureaucracy hacking is kind of a lofty term for talk to and empathize with your auditors
Yeah,
and get on
yeah,
the same side and like contribute to the values of the people who have the ability to stand in your way. Because all you need to do is move towards these auditors. In many cases, you might think, oh, it's going to be this impossible, difficult confrontation. And again, this is covered in both Turn the Ship Around and Never Split the Difference. When you approach somebody with that interaction loaded up, that's what you get. And there are specific examples, and it's discussed more particularly in Never Split the Difference. How, again, when we end up with law enforcement examples, we have to digest some of these things. We're learning that there are certain correctional officers that are better at diffusing their situations with inmates in detention facilities. So we're learning the emotional intelligence of effective prison guarding might not be the most tasteful behavior for
yeah,
people to be learning about. But there's this key thing here, which is what's going on is these people approach with a peaceful resolution in mind and a curiosity about what is happening and what the people involved need. And then it goes well. That is like carrying the successful interaction. The you talked a few times about getting to what people want. This starts with, and both books talk about this a lot, curiosity. Being curious and really listening. Turn the Ship Around introduces a difference between curious and being questioning. So the archetypal expression of this in that book is when, as a commanding officer, someone brings you an idea and you are curious about it, you ask questions differently than if you are questioning. And he discovered this on the difference between what he could act like and how he asked when he wanted to make sure the person he was questioning knew something that he already knew. And then being on a submarine where he did not have the technical detail to fall back on, he had curiosity instead. It was the naturally arising thing. And when you have curiosity as the naturally arising thing, you get better outcomes because you're not testing people, you are learning questions or you're learning information. And that curiosity then feeds back into, well, also, I'll point this out. This isn't described in the book, but I just put this together. Questioning interrupts the learning cycle that the intention expectation addressing format of I intend to, and I think it's appropriate because if you're trying to avoid questions and the person is testing you, you're going to start including all kinds of bullshit in your I think this is appropriate because to demonstrate your knowledge. So it's this oh there's a question in here space that I referred to that interferes with that loop. Another serious thing that interferes with that loop is if people are going to test you rather than trusting you.
yeah.
That curiosity, switching from curiosity or switching to curiosity creates, you carry all of these better versions of interactions just with you in your demeanor, in what you
Yeah,
trigger when you interact with people.
yeah. Once again, I think this is the investment in everyone's judgment. The thing I take away from Marquet is invest in everyone's judgment, structure it so that they can use their judgment, and have a structure that continues that into the future.
Yeah.
And I get, I'm back sputtering about how challenging this job really is.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to do this, it's a challenging job, and you like Voss. Voss hands you a toolkit that you can keep your soul with, because you can negotiate with people, you can say no, you can start with no, you can, and Voss points out many books too. So in that book, he must reference 15 or 20 books.
Yeah.
And So it's a compendium of books as well.
Well, so both of these have this element of this ability to invest in radical empathy, and you have to do this by gaining experience. You don't just, especially if you are in an organization where technical knowledge is very important. If technical capability is a dominant factor in the success of leadership in your organization, as it is in many engineering-led companies, which are generally the better places to work as a technical person, you're going to have this problem where questioning rather than curiosity is going to be the default until you lose touch with the underlying technologies. And engineers who enter leadership famously struggle to put that off as long as possible. They work so hard to do the study, to stay in the command and control mode. But what you actually want to do is practice the other mode. You need to gain experience with entering curiosity first. Turn the Ship Around gives you this I intend framework where everyone gets to practice being in curiosity and thinking about the other person and getting feedback about how well that worked. And Never Split the Difference contains all these negotiating frameworks and capability and tactics, these named techniques, but all of these are opportunities to practice entering radical empathy as well. This isn't a book guilty of this. You don't want to dust it off before a salary negotiation, sort of give it a skim, and then try and load up 2 or 3 valuable tactics. Now, negotiating at all with 2 or 3 valuable tactics, okay, I say you don't want to. Let's say instead you're leaving a lot of value on the table, because actually, systematically, Never Split the Difference has a full system for practicing every opportunity you get, moving to curiosity and achieving tactical empathy.
Yeah. And if you haven't read the book, it is a revelation because literally every paragraph is something like, oh my gosh, I don't know why I have never just done this. It makes total sense. And I found it one of the highest density page for page, like new ideas that I think that I had certainly ever read. And I've read a few negotiating books and I've certainly been around the block. And like this thing was a revelation to me just on every page.
Yeah, I do have to say about Never Split the Difference, it has a little bit of the pop psychology problem. It declares in its text that it is not a pop psychology book, but you don't actually get to say that about yourself. And it has some things in it, like there's some neuroscience, and it's kind of incidental neuroscience that doesn't really hold up. There's a quote: the amygdala, the part that generates fear, when it's talking about where people's brains light up under certain circumstances and what you can do to get them out of that. The amygdala does not generate fear. I understand that is, like there are scientists who might disagree with this, but the amygdala is an area of the brain that is associated with survival responses. And this is different from fear, which is an emotion word. You can read Joseph Liddell, I think it's Deux. I think that's pronounced Liddell. He's got a book, The Deep History of Ourselves, the 4 billion year story of how we got conscious brains. He's one of the original fear researchers who led to the statement, the amygdala is the part of the brain that generates fear, becoming popular. This first came to my attention in another book, How Emotions Are Made, which I will look up the author's name because I've forgotten it. Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about this thing too. So the neuroscience, you have to be willing to put in the pop sci, like, oh, it's been a few years and maybe this isn't the most modern information. Once you structurally make that translation, it's still really relevant. When you are triggered when you're generating survival responses, when you have a part of your brain that is you survival instructions, it doesn't really matter if you call that fear or something else. Really useful to know that doesn't always look like fear or feel like fear. But you get into a survival mode, you're constrained, you can't reason. If you put the person across from you into a survival mode, their options are constrained, they have a harder time reasoning. It's extremely valuable to have the insight that, like, there are neurochemical states, never mind emotion, never mind like rational responses about how someone should react. People's subjective experiences trigger them in ways, and you just need to see that it's happened and figure out how to recover it. So I wanted to mention that because I wrote a note about it where it's like, yeah, it has this collection of things, And I don't know. This is a book I feel myself wanting to apologize for, right? Which is a sign that it didn't sit on me quite perfectly. Turn the Ship Around, hilariously, despite being about the actual military, I'm like, no, this is fine. This is perfect. This is great. I love this. And
Yeah.
part of that is that Americans' default culture is actually incredibly militaristic. And so, I was raised on sci-fi stories based on war stories that fit perfectly back in to turn the ship around. I actually kind of want to rewrite it as like a space kablooey story where it's a hyperlight torpedo cruiser or whatever, because
Yeah.
it fits so smoothly into the grooves that Heinlein wore into my brain. To talk about the need for this huge mechanical system that is out on deployment to be fully capable of doing things, and for everyone to know that it's capable because of patriotism.
Yeah. Marquet actually really, I was struck by the book by his, and I don't, this word gets, people sneer at it, but his patriotism, his actual belief in country, his actual belief in service that comes through loud and clear in this book.
Yeah.
And, just even on the page, I would feel like a horrible person sneering at it, right? It's just so clear and so authentic.
Yeah, and I think it deserves a warning of like, hey, this is the cultural context of this book. This is the story and the concept it communicates in, and our world is complicated, and a lot of people are going to have relationships to that and reactions to that. Uh, I don't want you to put the book down when you're like, oh, this is for people who don't feel uncomfortable at the Pledge of Allegiance, and I do, so this book isn't for me. No, like it's that's not the reaction that will serve you. Put it
Yeah,
that way.
and I mean the kicker here is how many tech books have we read that are just totally divorced from reality?
Yeah,
Go tell your team XYZ and you'll win. Like, you are insane. That is not how it works. And the fact and lots of these tech books are done with people, way out in the standard deviations of, understanding and things like that. And you can't take anything from them. But this Marquet book is the real life example in a real world. Like, the Navy is one of the oldest institutions in the country,
yeah,
and they are hidebound. And even there, he can find the space to do this correct thing. And we haven't even said what the whole point of the book is, and why you really should dip into it, which is Marquet is just clear. There are a lot of IQ points in any group of people, and the leader follower model reduces them to the minimum amount. And that is not what you want on a nuclear
right.
submarine.
I don't know. Facilitating is very hard. Facilitation is a type of leadership that relies on not either technical expertise or order giving authority. So, one of the ways the book doesn't talk about this at all, but one of the stories that emerges for me is here is someone who boarded a submarine and decided to be a facilitator and committed to doing that. And he partly he couldn't he knew he would fail if he switched to giving orders because he knew he was missing the technical knowledge. So he was a little stuck, and I think it's a good story, and it's, I'm sure, part of his subjective experience, but also it lets him off the hook a little bit for doing such a radical thing, being like, well, I had to. Sorry, people who think I should have done technical excellence because they do technical excellence, individual technical excellence. I went with team technical excellence because it was what I had, and it worked better than what I would have done if I had had the thing I normally had. It gives him a little bit of an out to be like, well, if I'd been on a ship where I had what I needed, I never would have done this either. It's all right, all those people who aren't. I'm not better than you. You kind of have to, if you want to communicate to other captains, start with, well, I'm
Yeah.
not better than you.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that perfunctory requirement. What I would really say is back to this investment in judgment. The bottom line is hard non-cooperation gets you a much worse result than cooperation. And it's not just more area under the curve, it's better
Well,
dimensionality.
right. So let's talk about like the reason I bring up this difference in this standpoint that he's starting from and facilitation skills is that it's actually quite common to not have authority or technical competence available. he had authority to fall back on, and I think this is really important in terms of evaluating can this work in various places, because it is super easy for a leader who is not on board terminate this, to poison the entire endeavor. And when we had him on our show, we talked with him about cases where he'd seen that in his consulting and experienced it in his career. So it's like, this is not a criticism of the book. This is in the book and in the author. But it's actually really interesting for me to note that there is a big difference between a leader who stopped this and a leader who can create this. The leader who can create this needs extraordinary facilitation skills. And Never Split the Difference is some of that facilitation skill, but it points to maybe another missing book in the, okay, if you really want to do this sort of transformation thing, you need further, faster, and far less drama. You need another book that is at its core a facilitation manual.
Okay, we had Janet's on recently, and so this goes back to the tool set. The Fraser's tool set is it is the next level after Voss, essentially, because you can use these tools to walk into a room, and you can use it to facilitate. In an arbitrarily large room, we've seen it over and over again. The tools work like crazy. And look, the reason I believe we're trying to choose two books is because we just think, like, if you want a believable roadmap you could share with others, Turn the Ship Around is an amazing roadmap. And if you are going to undertake that journey, do not go without a tool set. And the Vossian tool set is to control you. Like, it's to make sure you don't make bad deals, that you are negotiating for, I really do appreciate this negotiating term, Pareto complete, negotiation,
Yeah.
where no one would change their strategy after you're done.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. But yeah, as you point out, like, you need further, faster, and far less drama if you are going to go do it writ large.
So I'm going to finish the thought about Turn the Ship Around. Marquet's commander, whose name I will not look up in time to be not awkward on a podcast, gave him what I think of as a Prussian style order. And that sounds pejorative, but it's not. I think Clausewitz has a mostly beneficial impact on Western culture. Anyway, the shape of that order is, here is what you need to do and why. Here's what you have available. Here's the resources you can call on. Let me know what you need. Let me know how it's going. Stay in touch, basically.
Yeah, it's a pioneering thing.
Within that order structure, if it's committed to, if this is something, the leader who had Marquet on this, I don't know, because it's not covered in the book, whether or not he could have personally done this, but the fact that he got to a position above captain and presumably spent time as a captain himself and did not invent any sort of leader system or do any of this radical stuff suggests that, maybe there's some truth to Marquet's I had to have special circumstances for me to have to do it thing, but also that, Marquet was the person who was going to be able to do this and who was personally committed to the skill set. He'd read all these books, The Habits of Effective People, the Deming stuff. The Deming stuff in particular is radical. And if you read it and you really integrate it, you will have to do something like leader. If you're like, okay, great, 80% of performance is the system, have to really focus on system changes and really focus on, this concept of you're leaving all this productive capacity and local knowledge, all of this capability on the table, because no one is offering it to you because they have no exposure to upside and they can't efficiently deliver it because you will stop and undermine them. That's all from Deming. So anyway, he came into this position and he was the right guy for it. He did it. And he had the skill set. That's all very special and very hard and a lot to ask of leaders. And you can't expect to have a leader who is fully on board with and capable of all of these things, capable of in detail always picking this harder way, and expect to succeed. But you don't need to. You just need someone who won't collapse it. And that's what Marquet had in his squadron commander. I'm probably messing up the names of the rank structure here, but like, that's what the commander who assigned him to this ship on short notice to turn it around gave. And I think that that's really important for people who are reading this book to know is, yeah, there are situations where you won't be able to succeed because your leadership won't be on board and you can't negotiate them to being on board. There are situations where even though they didn't hand the book to you, you handed the book to them, they can let it happen. They can be on board. They can align to it. And you may be able to negotiate them to that state. If they don't start
Yep.
there, if they can credibly say, okay, let's give it a time and a space and leave you the space, you have a chance to see if you have the process skill to realize some of these outcomes. And you can start with yourself and you can begin pulling in all these other toolkits that you might have access to start working. But that precondition has to be that someone is not going to collapse your authority away from you or do a rug pull.
Yeah.
And I think
And
both these books have that characteristic too. You don't actually need everyone to be aligned on further, farther, and far less drama to use it. You don't technically need everyone to be aligned on Never Split the Difference, but it is, both of those books are, if the other person has also read the book, you are at no disadvantage.
correct. Yeah, we've talked about these. Yeah, that's one of your like more famous quotes to me about Never Split the Difference is like, read it because even if both of you have read it, you will negotiate better. You can't. It's the advantage accrues to both of you.
Right. And there are techniques where you're doing this thing where it's like it's an adversarial technique. It's not all radical empathy, and then you don't do anything to bring someone through psychological stages to your target or whatever. But it doesn't hurt for them to be aware that these are things or to be trying to do this back to you. So
Yeah.
I like that. Turn the Ship Around moves fully into this other place of it's an alignment tool. These two books, if you're going to try and form an alliance with people, if you're going to try and work at a company or start a partnership or whatever, and you can align on like, hey, we believe in Never Split the Difference, in not asking each other to do things that we can't do. This is the thing, actually. You gave your one takeaway, your big takeaway. My first big takeaway from the previous time I read Never Split the Difference was that it is extremely effective when someone is asking you for something in a negotiation and they're presenting terms to ask, how do you expect me to do that? Right? This reality orientation. How do you expect me to do that? And there's a blustery adversarial response that can be given. It's not like an instant win button or whatever. If you're doing all these things to try and get towards reality orientation, it's really great for both of you to ask, how do you expect me to do this? Like, I hear what you want. It sounds what you like. Jerry Weinberg has this line. That's a wonderful thing to want. I don't know how to do it. And I think that how do you expect me to do this line is also just an amazing thing. If both people are armed with that, you'll be in a better situation. If both people are aligned to that, negotiation isn't going to feel gross to either of you. It's this thing that you both know about. I don't know if you've ever watched 30 Rock, but there's this ridiculous episode where Liz Lemon finds and reads Donaghy's negotiation book, and then they're using his ridiculous like high power corporate negotiation tactics on each other, and then like holding this meta frame of being like, oh, you did the thing to me that you're good, but that means I'm good for having taught you. Like, I don't know. This is a book where that could happen if you want to live that particular silly sitcom, but in a good way.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing about these things is they both fall the rule set falls away once you start understanding the value. Your own judgment will bring you to the value into what tools work.
Yeah. Let's see. We've gone on quite a long time, and I think we've done both these books a fairly good turn. I want to see if I have any other notes that I really wanted to cover. Oh yeah. So this is mostly Turn the Ship Around. This is not I don't have a way to tie these two books together on this. Maybe you will. There's a cool thing in Turn the Ship Around that I did not pick up on my first read through that they call deliberate action, acting deliberately. Again, let me get to my note and get the deliberate action. So the deliberate action thing is a fix that they applied to an audit failure. Again, an alternative to punishment. Had a particular scenario where we're supposed to be doing something safely to switch the power system the submarine was on in a way that is important to the auditors. No actually dangerous condition occurred, but a red flag that is attached to something where that thing is not supposed to be moved while the red flag is on it. There's a whole procedure for clearing the red flag. A crewman ignored it and just did the thing because he knew it was in a safe condition. And again, there's this embrace the auditors thing where he's like, this falls kind of on the line of whether or not it has to be reported, but we decided to report it and have a meeting and have all the stakeholders there. They had this 8-hour meeting. They did not expect it. This is a side note that, like, space for important meetings to just go on is something that I saw depicted in this book as something that can happen that I've just never seen as advice. And it's not even explicitly offered as advice in this book. But it's interesting to me to note that if you really mean it on this stuff, you have to leave time people to really work through things. Anyway, so the disciplinary part of this meeting was very short at the beginning, where they asked the crewman, why did you do this? You know not to do this. And he's like, it's true. I don't know. I can't imagine what I was thinking. I knew it was in a safe condition, but I also knew not to do the thing. And I pushed the flag aside and I pulled the lever. And was like, all right, you can go. Because the rest of the meeting, again, this is that Deming thing. That guy's performance is 80% about the surrounding system. What system could possibly arise where this guy would not have made this error? And really holding people accountable, the crew, the auditors, everyone who is, when I say the crew, I mean the officers in this meeting, holding the officers and the auditors accountable for saying, could that really have fixed it? You're talking about introducing a new, and I've seen this so many times in, security or audit response or whatever. Could this have really fixed it? No? Okay, it's not a valid response. We're not doing that. That costs us something and gives us nothing. What else? What could we do that would really address it? And they came up with deliberate action, which is when you are operating a nuclear submarine, before you do steps, position yourself to do them and say what you are going to do. Announce what you're going to do. And it's funny, it reminds me of things that I'm struggling to pull the context. I've heard other people doing this. Apparently, the nuclear auditors call it point and shoot, and they have also been trained on it. So it's something that there's like other traditions around. But it meant that they were on board with deliberate action as an intervention. But deliberate action then causes them to score ridiculously high on audits, to have unheard of performance on the operation of the nuclear plant in their ship. The auditors during the debrief were like, actually, your people tried to make as many errors as everyone else usually does make, but then they kept stopping each other. Right? This deliberate action and people working together thing allows people to take that moment and say, you're about to do what? Like, hold, don't do that. I've seen this so much in pairing. I have, when we were doing operation pairing at Pivotal, where we're running shell commands and we're under pressure and there's an incident going on, we would type shell commands as comments. We would type it out and not press enter. We would say, okay, we're going to pair on this command. And, with the shell command, the person, you can read it. So this isn't quite the same as deliberate action, but we sort of naturally fell into this when we felt that elevated pressure. TDD is another form of deliberate action. You can see echoes of it everywhere, but I thought that was another really interesting thing, because that's the only type of systematic intervention where you change how people are working, affords everyone practice and opportunities to pay attention and turn their brains on, which they won't do as soon as you give them headroom to do that. They're well trained into the mode they're in. And so the deliberate action thing is another case of, hey, you have to get people habituated to paying attention and thinking, I'm going to be asked why I think this is okay from a certain perspective. I need to have radical empathy for that, and I need to develop good answers. I'm going to have to say out loud what all the steps of this process are. I need to know what they'll be. I'm going to be asked curious questions about how something works when I want to do this. I need to be prepared to answer those. All of these create a genuine need to do cognitive behavior that is hard to do otherwise. It is very easy to lazily avoid. And I love that about, I was wrong. This does tie both the books back together. I love that about both of these books. That Turn the Ship Around repeatedly describes these systems that activate and harness all of that latent capability throughout the crew, shows them practicing it and being brought around on it, not as a spontaneous thing that you get right away, but something that people have to be habituated to, and then they can deliver incredible results. And similarly, Never Split the Difference has all of these techniques and toolkit throughout it where you can, in order to use them, you have to habituate yourself to asking certain questions, entering radical empathy, or not radical, tactical. Radical, tactical, same difference. Empathy, and operating from there. And I think that's where I would sort of sum up and leave it. Both of these are something that you can use to align around. So you can calibrate with each other about what you expect and what your goals are and how you're going to conduct yourself. And both of these leave you in a framework for activating, not just in yourself, but in the people around you, a type of thinking that people tend to avoid even when they value it theoretically.
Yeah, I'll strongly agree on that. That whole system thing is the thing. If we're gonna roll off, here's how I would wrap, because I frequently go to places that they need some assistance, and this toolkit it shows you what you could get. Here's what we could do in a real worked scenario, but you have to go to never split the difference, because you're going to go have to talk to everyone.
Hmm.
You cannot get a process like leader through an organization by fiat. And it is a grind, a grind, a grind. It gets better, because as soon as you get a partner or a pair who also is into it, then it just gets better and better, and you can snowball. But it's a build.
Yeah. And I'll say this, you can negotiate your way into people not stopping you. You can negotiate your way into people giving things a chance. You can negotiate your way into certain types of compliance. You cannot negotiate your way into adopting leader. You you can use tactical empathy and facilitation to get to leader. But negotiation ultimately is a frame that is replicating the ability to give orders. That's fine. It's really useful to be able to conjure as much order giving as you can in any given situation. If you embrace that frame too strongly, you cannot use it to implement something like turn the ship around. You can only use it to create the conditions in which you can facilitate something like turn the ship around. And I think that that's something that people will struggle with, that Marquet reports struggling with. One of the reasons these two books go together so well is that they temper each other's shortcomings in this way. I recommend reading them both, one after the other. Read Turn the Ship Around first, but if you have only one of these, I think Never Split the Difference gets you closer to the ability to benefit from technical excellence. Personally, individually, just being able to get into situations where you can, because it lets you create preconditions and then you can start with yourself. If you want to perpetuate that, if you want to have that last beyond the little glow of getting one thing right or accomplishing one thing, if you want to avoid burnout, if you want to build something great, you need to proceed through Turn the Ship Around and some of the other things that we'll talk about in future episodes.
Perfect. And so again, the books are Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. Even if you don't have the books, these guys are crazy online. Chris Voss is all over the place, and even just a 30-minute thing with him is always interesting. And then Turn the Ship Around, David Marquet is, he publishes, I think, almost daily. He's got 400, when we checked out, leadership prompts, like 2-minute leadership prompts. He records them all the
And
time.
Marquet really appreciates the need to practice how hard it is to give up giving orders. He has an exercise where you go into a restaurant and eat food without giving an order. Amazing.
Nudge 61. All right, Jesse, that is a great episode. We've known we have to do the books forever. We got two of the important books in the can, and you want to preview what the next three books really are?
Well, so we've talked before the next set of books, and I don't have the written list in front of me, but I believe we got to have XP Explained in there at some point.
Of course.
And I'm convinced myself that Further, Farther, and Far Less Drama is actually part of the canon. Now that I'm thinking about it again, this we have to you and I still need to firm out exactly how we're categorizing and proceeding through this list, but I think that's there. We talked with Brian Kroger about the book Scaling Up. I think is a tactical, like a business model framework, and I think this is really important for if you need to go somewhere or find somewhere that is credibly able to take advantage of your technical excellence. I think a business model framework and a rubric for engaging with business model frameworks is critical. So that's our candidate there. What else? Yeah, you had at least one or
We,
two others.
we have an ongoing discussion, we'll call it, about Eric Ries' Lean Startup.
Right. Yeah.
And we generally agree that book is groundbreaking and important, but really, if you have to learn product management, not exactly the book. And we don't have a great
Yeah, it has a lot of
alternative.
characteristics. the quality of a book isn't just the ideas in it. Turn the Ship Around is also calibrated to its audience. It has this sort of like, will he succeed under time pressure, military saga characteristic. It's propulsive. These are not things I would say about Lean Startup. The ideas in it and the title are why that book is important, right? My impression is that at some point Eric Ries became someone who needed to write a book, and that book to like sort of build what they was actually doing in terms of advice and consulting. So it's that. There's a whole Lean library, specific books. Again, in our talk with Brian Kroger, he highlighted that the Lean Enterprise was fantastically useful for his specific situation. I haven't read these books. I don't know exactly how to talk about a whole library as one of 5 books or whatever. So we've talked about that. And it's really about things like an innovation budget and things like product market fit and things like prioritizing in order of risk, or, you know, turning that value priority into something that isn't necessarily about delivering revenue for an established business, which is kind of how we would or savings, you know, bottom line impact for a traditional business. But also value order might be about product market fit exploration, market discovery, right? Like there are these other things that you can organize yourself in terms of. That needs to be expressed. You got to cover a book that does a good job of introducing all these things. We just don't know which one it is yet. Do we have any others that were, I mean, Blind Sight is an honorary member because we kicked the podcast off with it. We've already talked about it. You want to cover Echopraxia next.
Oh, Echopraxia is so good. It's so good. I'm making my 11-year-old listen to it, even though it's full of adult content. I'm like, you have to hear this.
Yeah, so that's our sort of prototype list. We'd love to hear if people think that there are either the books we put in already. It's like, hey, actually, I have one thing I would love is a replacement for Never Split the Difference. I don't mind it. It's a great book. It deserves its position here. I would like one that I didn't need to apologize as much for in the neuroscience, in the sort of the context, the content of the stories.
Yeah.
In terms of basic posture, I'm not looking for a replacement for Turn the Ship Around. But if someone brought me one that was better, I would lose my mind. That'd be so amazing. I just don't think it's going to happen. Yeah. So if people have suggestions or comments on any of those, or any of the ones that we've done, we'd love to hear from you. We have email addresses, don't we, Tony?
We do. It'll be right at the end of the podcast here.
Great. Shall we leave it there?
Let's do it. That's it.
All right. Until next time.
All right, everyone. You've been listening to Radio Free XP. It's Friday, April 12th, 2024.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Radio Free XP. If you're interested in helping with graphics, bumper music, or other aspects of production, or if you'd like to be on the show, please contact Jesse Alford or Tony Hansman on the Pivotal Alum Slack. You can also reach us via email at jesse.alford@pm.me or precept@gmail.com, respectively.